Hi, welcome to C2G Talk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, C2G's Director of Communications, and I'm speaking today with Manuel Pulgar-Vidal. He's the leader of the climate and energy practice of the Worldwide Fund for Nature International. He was formerly Minister of State for Environment in Peru and President of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 20th Conference of the Parties, COP20. A lawyer with over 27 years of experience in the field of environmental law and policy, he founded the Peruvian Society for Environmental Law, one of the most recognized organizations of environmental law in the region. And in his role as Minister of State for Environment in Peru, he was responsible for proposing and defining Peru's environmental policies, including those covering biodiversity and climate change. He was also in charge of implementing the country's environmental legislation and its enforcement policies. Welcome, Manuel Pulgar-Vidal.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark.
So right now, the world is facing multiple interlocking crises, including on biodiversity and climate change. How ready is the world to tackle these crises in a joined-up way?
I think that we have developed good measures. Also, we are showing that we are moving good actions, but we know that we are not yet on track. That is important to mention it. And you have brought an important term, locking. So the idea, to connect, the connection in between climate and nature. And I think that connection, that nexus in between both concepts are key for our future action, because we cannot address the climate crisis if it is not with nature. And we know that one of the key drivers of nature loss, it is climate change. So, and also because of the pandemic has told us that we have to connect climate, nature, and health. So we are now in this crisis. Let me say something before of going more directly to the question. We are in an emergency, but our actions are not yet fitting with the concept of emergency.
Right.
If you compare, Mark, what we have done in relation to the pandemic, that is clearly actions to face an emergency. Lockdown, quarantines, and all those kind of things. There are not an equivalent yet in climate. So I hope that we have learned from the pandemic what does it mean to live in an emergency. So that is also important to mention. But in case of climate, we have clarity on where to go. And that is very important. I am used to reminding former President Hollande phrases in Marrakesh, in the COP after the Paris one, when he said, the Paris Agreement, it is irreversible and unstoppable. Mm-hmm. And it is key because also what it is true and what I can add, it is that we are now living in a new climate economy world. So the economy of the world has already changed, has already switched into included more climate consideration. So that is positive. But we do need still to move countries and to encourage countries and non-state actors into more clear and ambitious action. So that in relation to climate. Unfortunately, it is not happening exactly the same with nature, with biodiversity. We are close, so 1.5 months ahead of ending 2020, that it is the end of the decade on biodiversity. And unfortunately, we haven't achieved what we had expected it would achieve. And the point it is that probably we don't have a clear vision on where to go when we think about nature and biodiversity. So this idea of living in harmony with nature, it is good, for sure, right, but it's not a measurable vision. So the point it is how much by COP15 in Kunming, China in 2021, we can define a more clear vision that can move more strongly our actions toward that. So to summarize this answer, things are happening. We are not yet on traction. We are moving our actions in the correct direction, but we do need to act based on the concept of urgency, ambition, and emergency.
I mean, you mentioned just then the sense that from the pandemic, we understood what it was to be in an emergency and to act faced with an emergency. A lot of people in this world that we inhabit in terms of the environmental groups and governments dealing with this say and suggest they understand the crisis, whether or not they have a clear vision. But do you think that deep down there is a sense of emergency yet, an emotional, visceral connection with the sense that we really are at a stage when things can go very badly indeed, or we can avoid those worst outcomes?
Look, I think that not yet. No, I think that going deeply into this emergency concept, I think that there are still actors that are denying the situation, and not only in the citizen level, but also in the political level. No, and unfortunately, after the Paris Agreement, the world has changed probably too much. No, so we have moved our world, our planet, from the hope of 2015 with the Paris Agreement into a very strong polarized world with a lot of denialism, with a lot of people opposing to adopt climate consideration and climate action. But let me say something. I used a couple of years ago, this analogy. This is like the last rice that it is avoiding to be detached from the pot that we are cleaning up. No, so when you prepare rice, you know that there are some rice that it is very hard to detach. That is happening, and we knew that this would happen. So, for example, traditional economic activities as fossil fuels, or obsolete for now obsolete technology and obsolete equipment, internal engine vehicles, for sure they will insist in trying to sell their product. That is why we should keep the idea of where the economy is moving to and what kind of immediate actions we should take. No, that is key for me. That is key, for example, for a developing country. No, if we are able to define how are we planning to go into a net zero world by 2050, probably we would be more able to define a strong and more immediate actions to move our countries into that. That is why the importance of encouraging countries to define their long-term strategies. That is key to change this current situation in which, again, people is denying that climate change is happening.
So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, speaking of net zero, says to achieve net zero, but also to stay under 1.5 degrees warming by the end of the century, the world would need both to rapidly cut emissions, obviously, and to remove billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. And of course, the amount that needs to be removed relates to how fast emissions are cut. What role could nature-based approaches achieve in this drawing down of CO2 from the atmosphere, whilst also meeting the biodiversity challenge at the same time?
Yeah, interesting question, Mark, because nature can play a strong role to address the climate crisis. And nature-based solutions, we know that it is getting traction as a key element. It is the low-hanging fruit to do that. So to build that nexus in between nature and climate, and to address the climate crisis and also the nature loss crisis. But let me say a couple of things before of moving into answering your question. First, we know that when we talk, for example, about nature-based solutions, we are still talking about an evolving concept. That fortunately, it is evolving positive. It is evolving strongly, but still evolving. And why I am saying this? Because first, we do need to agree within all of the different actors that when we talk about nature-based solutions, we are talking about three main values. First, a sustainable intervention to nature. That is key. Second, to address a societal challenge. And third, that can create benefits, co-benefits. So why I am saying this? To raise the importance of this phrase. Not every intervention in nature, it is a nature-based solution.
Right.
And unfortunately, probably until now, that is still happening. So that concept that it has been developed by IUCN, it is getting traction, what it is good. Next step that also by IUCN, it has been raised, it is the need of criteria, standards. So that is why the importance of the standard that IUCN released some weeks ago that are defining how can we measure, for example, the societal challenge that we are planning to address. How can we measure the co-benefit? How can we measure the rights of indigenous people?
So, sorry, just in IUCN is International Union for Conservation of Nature.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, just for listeners.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we do need to keep that into consideration. So that it is about nature-based solution, but there could be some other interventions into nature that are not nature-based solution, but that can play a role in relation to our climate crisis. But there is an addition. The point it is we know where to go. We know that our objective it is a net zero economy by 2050. The point it is, based on that, what it must be our primarily obligation, the most mandatory one, real reduction. Real reduction, it is key. So the point it is that when we put, for example, nature-based solutions or some other intervention on nature, with our primarily the top priority in basing the Paris Agreement of our obligation, we should keep that top priority in that position. So the reality is that we do need to have real reduction, and we do need to make all of our efforts to produce those reductions. And probably the point, Mark, it is that we haven't yet developed those actions that can strengthen real reduction. So that is probably the reason why there are many doubts on the role that nature could play. The people know that it would play a key role, but the point it is that it shouldn't limit our vision to real reduction. That is, for me, the top priority.
Right. So can you share with us some promising nature-based approaches to this challenge? And also, how much of a role, and I don't know if you can quantify this, but in the sense of it, some people suggest, maybe it could all be done like this. And other people would suggest that, well, actually, you're going to need much more of a portfolio and there are limits and so forth. How much of a role do you think various approaches, nature-based approaches, could play in drawing down the CO2 from the atmosphere?
Okay, so when you talk about nature-based approaches, the point it is how much you are talking about CDR, so carbon dioxide removal,
Right.
Because those are interventions, that could be focused mostly in nature, but also in technology. So we cannot treat all as the same. But when we think about the nature approaches, for sure there are some that are not only key, but it has been recognized by the science as the key one, Because let me put again the example of Peru. Our main source of emission, it is land use change and deforestation. And that is happening with most of the countries that are located in tropical forests. And the additional point, Mark, it is that land use and that deforestation, it has been caused not by a commercial activity or an economic activity, but because of poverty. So we know that if we want to cut our emissions, we have to focus our action to address that problem. In that sense, restoration, it is a key one, because we are talking about ecosystem that has suffered a lot of degradation, that has been deforested. And the point it is, by working in restoration, we can not only address the climate crisis, but on the other hand, the nature crisis. For sure, management and natural regeneration of forests, it is a key one when we think about on a nature-based approach. Enhancement of soil carbon, it is a third idea. And these three ideas also are strongly related to the economic recovery. When we think about the post-pandemic time, we do need to promote activities that must fit not only with our long-term vision, but also that in the short term can promote employment. And in that sense, the relation in between these nature-based approaches with the economic recovery, it is a key one. So those are three examples in which we are not talking about technology, but it is about a nature-based approach.
Yes. But do you have a sense of the nature-based approaches? and the technology, do you have a sense of the balance of I guess it depends to a certain extent on what we do now and how fast we go to emission reductions, but do you have a sense that you may need a balance between the two and how that balance might play out?
Yeah, look, we know that is something that it has been suggested by the Paris Agreement. So to get that balance, no, so that is clear. The point it is how acceptable in the short term that kind of technology must be. And that is why I recognize the effort of C2G, that it is to work in relation to governance, how to govern this kind of measure. And it is interesting that C2G, it is working in some principles, actors, different levels, risk assessment, management, rules and regulation, as for example, code of conduct. I would like, in this sense, to add some other principles when we think about this kind of technology. First, we should keep our main priority. And as I've already mentioned, our main priority, our top priority, it is real reduction. In this sense, this kind of intervention with technology must be exceptional, at least for now. No, it must be exceptional. Because as we know that we haven't yet promoted actions for real reduction, not all the effort that we can put for this top priority, this kind of intervention must be exceptional. Also, when we think about technology, this technology have to prove that could promote benefits and are sustainable. That is, for me, a key principle. Also, in this sense, Mark, what we do need to have, it is consideration of what it is called the mitigation hierarchy. That is interesting, as you probably have heard, SBTI is working on that, in the mitigation hierarchy towards net zero. And they are talking about residual emissions, that it is key, for example, for the hard-to-abate sector.
Sure.
We do need to consider safeguards, and these are mostly social consideration. We do need to consider responsibility and liability when we are thinking about this kind of technology. And also, this technology must be based on science. And if we can develop mechanisms as insurance to secure that we are not going to damage. So those are the elements that, for me, could make more feasible to talk about of this kind of intervention. But again, in a time in which our top priority must be to real reduction. Let me talk about the mitigation hierarchy. We are in a time in which not only in the country level, but in the business level, many corporations are defining their climate leadership by identifying their claim. And fortunately or unfortunately, depends on how you can see it, there are many terms, many claims. So carbon neutral, carbon positive, climate positive, net zero, among some others. And in some way, Mark, this is creating lack of credibility, and that is not good for the process. So our effort must focus in how can we create credibility, how can we really track progress in those kind of claims, how can we avoid any kind of greenwashing, etc. So that is why SBTI is working in this net zero concept. And they are defining clearly what does it mean, the net zero. And the net zero are strongly related to what it is called the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Right. So how much you can do in your own process, but also how much can you define clear actions in all your supply chain, Right. That it is the scope 3. So those are the primarily obligations of any corporation when they define their target into a net zero. And with that, you can define, and for sure, you cannot treat every sector as a single one, because there are some sectors that are more hard to abate. You can define what does it mean residual emission. And with that residual emission, you can work in some mechanism to produce the balance that the Paris Agreement are suggesting us. But the point it is that we must focus in these steps in a time in which we haven't yet gotten into real reduction. We should continue focusing on those real reductions.
You used the term earlier, restoration. we see this term all around at the moment, restoring, even sometimes repairing. I'd be interested in understanding a little bit more about how you understand that term restoration, because we see different groups starting to use it in different ways, but we see this sort of theme emerging. I'd be very interested in your view. Can we restore to what it was, or what is it? What exactly do we mean by restoration?
Yeah, it is a key question, because when we think about the degraded land, degraded forest, first of all, we do need to be clear what does it mean. Because when we think about a degraded forest, it is not because there is not, or there are not commercial species, or commercial wood. If the forest is still functioning, in sense, it is maintaining its ecological functioning, it is not a degraded forest, despite that there couldn't be commercial species. So that is the first element. But when you have already defined that, probably you can identify clear degraded land. The point it is, when we think about restoration, it is how can we keep that ecological function. That is, for me, key when we think about restoration. So if we are talking about diverse forests, as in the tropical forest in the Amazon, the idea it is to restore it, with a species that can keeping this ecological functioning, and that keep the functioning of the ecosystem itself. So yes. It is not through a plantation, it should be by maintaining or by manage the diversity of the forest. Also, when we think about restoration, we are talking about ways of working in the land or in the forest that cannot affect the current situation of the forest as capturing emissions. So there are many elements that are more related to sustainability, to rights of the people, to extension of the land, and to level of intervention when we think about restoration.
Do you think there's a possibility that some people will use that term in different ways to pursue certain agendas?
There could be, but the point is that if we are clear on what is that criteria and what are those safeguards and what are those standards, as it has been produced for nation-based solutions by IUCN, I think that we can gradually be more clear on what does it mean. And let me say something, Marco. IUCN has produced this standard, but IUCN, it is a non-formal in sense, despite that they have in their body government, the point it is that as we are moving nation-based solutions or nation-based approaches into the formal process, probably that, and I hope that we can get that formalization by COP26, it is clear that what it could happen, it is that the parties, the countries, are going to demand more clarity on what that means. In that sense, the use of principles, the use of standards and criteria will be key, for the future of the nation-based approach.
There are some other proposals, which have also been referred to in IPCC reports, to reflect sunlight back into space to lower temperatures, known under the umbrella as solar radiation modification or solar geoengineering for some. Have you got any thoughts on these ideas? Are we in any way, is the world in any way ready to start addressing and thinking and discussing about these ideas?
Yeah. Look, to discuss never or should never mean that we are accepting something. So as an organization, we are open to discuss, we are open to see how should we define governance rule for this kind of discussions or decisions. That is a key element. But anything that could divest our main objective, it should be at least postponed, if not rejected. Okay? So that is the first, because again, if we are going to look over some kind of anthropogenic interventions to solve our problem, that it is not based in the real reductions or in the role of nature to address the climate change, we are just duplicating what had made us to be here in this crisis. So the point is that we do need to leave behind our arrogance as human beings no, to think that by technology, by putting or by spraying this in the atmosphere, we are going to solve the problem. No, we know that it has been because emission. We don't need to cut that emission. So that is my first element. The second element, it is more related to how well it has been already proved the sustainable effect of that technology. No, and the point it is that if it has not already proved and by consensus, so it is not just about the scientists, it is about the consensus of different parties, we should again or postpone it or reject it. No, so that is a key element. And my third reflection in relation to this kind of technology, it is that probably we are more used to using this kind of names, no, as a single one. And the point it is that, for example, some of those interventions could be land intensive, and the idea it is to avoid to creating more problems on land by this intense use of land. Sorry for sometimes I still have some mistakes in my English, but also probably the demand of energy, it could be a difficulty. So also we do need to define how much this kind of technology could affect, not only directly, but indirectly. And that is why, let me come back to the idea of principles. We do need to have governance principles to address this kind of things.
Before I move on to the next question, I just wanted to ask one thing. You use the phrase nature-based solutions a lot, and obviously that refers to IUCN definitions and so on. At the same time, there is this phrase carbon dioxide removal, which is used in the IPCC to basically bring both nature-based approaches and technology-based approaches.
Yeah.
Sometimes, though, I wonder in the conversation, do you think that people see the concept of nature-based solutions as something different to carbon dioxide removal, almost as though one is seen as the nature, one is seen as the technology? I'm trying to understand how people are using these terms.
Yeah, probably, yes. Probably the people is using the concept with a strong difference. No? Because when we think about nature-based solutions, and if you read the standards and if you check the concept, probably people is not thinking in altering intervention. And when we think about CDR, right, we are talking about that kind of altering technology. So nature-based solutions, it is not probably in the mind of many people, no, as part of a CDR, no, of a nature intervention based in the CDR concept. Yeah.
Interesting. So you have touched on this already, but I'd love to just explore a little bit more. What role is WWF playing in driving and thinking, driving conversations about carbon dioxide removal and even potentially solar radiation modification? Is it getting involved to some extent in these ideas? And
yeah, as you know, we are discussing with the C2G, no, in relation to how can we promote governance rules in relation to this kind of intervention. And also we have released a year ago, or probably more than a year ago, a position about CDR. No? So yes, we are clear in defining what kind of interventions are suitable, which one are not. And to be clear, for us, desirable approaches as WWF, restoration of ecological functions, natural regeneration of forests, enhancement of soil carbon, not actively support afforestation, no, that could have a negative social impact, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture and storage, and not suitable large-scale ocean fertilization. So that is the position of WWF when we talk about it.
And do you think we'll see some more sort of direct discussion of some of the carbon dioxide removal in the IUCN beyond the nature-based solutions discussion, but actually also to some of the technological approaches as well?
Yeah, it could be. No, I hope so. No, the point is that in a World Conservation Congress as the IUCN one, probably that discussion is going to be strongly contentious. No, probably you will see the different, even the extreme position in relation to this topic. But okay, that is the way that we have discussed things, no? And despite of how contentious it could be, I think it could be a good room to have those kind of discussions, for sure.
And can you see, in terms of the roles that the Convention on Biological Diversity might play in these discussions and the UNFCCC, how do you see the discussions about some of these other carbon dioxide removal approaches coming up, and what kind of connection do you see between these two processes in terms of discussing them?
Yeah, interesting, because when we think about those conventions and incoming COPs, we can separate the formal discussions, so the negotiation, and the non-formal discussion. Many side events, many kind of different seminars, and those kind of things. So, and when we think about the formal side, it is clear that negotiators are used to discussing based on mandates. The point it is that there is not a mandate to discuss those kind of things. So probably in this formal side, we won't see that kind of discussion. But in case of that formal process, we hope that at least we could have a recognition of nation-based solutions as a mechanism to address our climate objective. And as it has been identified as a top priority by the president of COP26, we hope that that could be achieved. That in relation to the to the UNFCCC COP. It is different with the CBD. As you know, Mark, and I am not blaming anybody by saying this, the CBD community is more conservative. And that is why they are still, until today, keeping the idea of ecosystem-based approaches. And they are more reluctant to include this concept of nation-based solution. I hope that finally we can align both conventions, because we do need both conventions well aligned. In sense of the non-formal debate, for sure, these kind of things could be debated, could be discussed. And I think that is a good way to move this discussion forward. Despite of all the controversies that it could create, I think that this kind of discussion will happen or in the COP26 or in the COP15 on CBD.
I wanted to ask a question, if I may, about Latin America and the role that the region might play, as Latin America has often been in the forefront of sustainable environmental services and innovation. Do you see, what kind of opportunities and challenges do you see for Latin America in talking about carbon dioxide removal and addressing it, potentially implementing it, both on the nature-based solution side of it and on the technology side?
Yeah, let me start by saying that there is no a single Latin America. Probably we are used to thinking in a very colleague way that there is a single Latin America. There is no. Probably, in my point of view, ideologically, there are three Latin Americas. One more free market. The second one, it is the ALBA countries. The third one, it is Brazil, that country continent. So it is important to mention. Secondly, unfortunately, not yet Latin America has defined clearly what it would be their long-term strategy and their short-term action. So I think that probably I am wrong, but I think that just Chile and Costa Rica have made that. But just two countries in a big continent, it is not enough. And that probably could limit any kind of consideration to CDR or to nation-based solution. But on the other hand, it is interesting because if you go back to the current indices of Latin America, in most of the country, the main source of emission it is deforestation, land degradation, and land use. So in this time in which they are working in enhancing NDCs, the point is what role a nature approach could have in enhancing that NDC. But it could take some time. Probably we are not enough mature, and I am talking about countries, to consider those kind of interventions when we think about how much nature approaches can support them to enhance NDCs or to raise their ambition. But what it is happening, it is that fortunately Latin America is starting to discuss about nation-based solutions.
Right.
That is important. No? We have the seed of something that it is coming in relation to nation-based solutions.
Right.
Probably not too much about Syria.
I mean, do you think that there's awareness in the general public discourse, either amongst policymakers, but also amongst the sort of wider community, that the challenge as laid out by the IPCC is not that stopping emissions is not enough? You also need to bring some CO2 down as well, between 100 and 1,000 billion tons, I think, according to the 1.5 degree report. Do you think there's an awareness of the scale of that challenge that's identified and acceptance of it?
I think that, as I've already mentioned, Mark, we know that by the end we will achieve our objective by creating this balance that it is in the Paris Agreement. But I think that the awareness now, it is for the reduction, for the real reduction.
Right.
No? Not only in Latin America, I think that most of the world, most of the organizations have double level. Because probably we don't need to focus now, no, in one priority, no, to trying to move it and to push it as much as we can, no,
right.
And probably later we should be more concerned about on how to produce that balance. But for now, and because we still have room to push for that, we should encourage and working with that objective.
So moving forward in some of these discussions, how do we're interested in governance, the C2G initiative, and governance being a very broad process. How do you involve, the marginalized, the poor, those who traditionally might not have a voice in some of these discussions? From your experience, how can, for example, small-scale farmers be brought into these kind of discussions about where we head on nature-based solutions or other approaches?
Look, it is difficult, and it is not just about small farmers. It is about indigenous people, as in case of South America and Amazon-based countries. But probably the starting point to do that, it is recognize the rights. No? So we must avoid by our interventions, even as it could be the most top and clear sustainable intervention, we should do it by recognizing their rights, no? And we are talking about rights over the land, rights over the forest, and also the recognition and respect of their traditional knowledge, no? And way of living and working. So that is the first step, no? The second one, it is that any intervention must include them, no? In the forest management, in the restoration action, and in all those kind of things, no? Because what we do need to avoid it is to have in this starting time, in this beginning of this process, the rejection, no? As it was with RED, no? Mark, how difficult it was, no, to move any kind of RED plus, and even with the plus, no, into traditional communities, into indigenous people, no, because they felt that this kind of market, no, could jeopardize their own rights, no. So the point it is that
sorry, by RED, it's reducing emissions from deforestation and
degradation, the plus, no, okay, no, and you know that it wasn't until now, no, it has created a lot of reaction, no. So the point it is, first, to recognize the right and respect it. Second, to include them in any kind of solution. That is the way to do it. And we do need to make understandable what is the co-benefit that this kind of intervention is going to produce. First, again, that it is sustainable, that it is to address a societal challenge that could affect them, right. And then that in the co-benefit, one of the benefits is for the people. No? So that is why the importance of the concept and standards and criteria.
If I could just ask a last question about your philosophy, approach, emotional response. We work in an area which can seem quite depressing and may even seem potentially lead some to despair about the size of the challenge. At the same time, everybody looks for hope and action that can work. How do you balance both maintaining a hope with a realism as to, the size of the challenge at hand.
Yeah, you know that realism, it is key, no? But let me tell you, Mark, I am optimistic by nature. I remember that I was, when I was president of COP20 in 2014, people used to ask me why you are so optimistic, no? And I am still optimistic because it is not just about the evidence that things are starting to happen. But for me, the most important element, it is that the economy has started to change.
Right.
And that is key. No, that is key. And also that is the way to convince internally in our countries to decision makers. So I am going to tell you something that probably it could be misunderstood. In Peru and in Latin America, now I am used to saying, if you want, forget the Paris Agreement. And it sounds weird because I was strongly involved and still strongly involved in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But what I am trying to say is, it is not about a document. It is about the economy. So what we must think on, it is on what it could be the consequences of our lack of action. What it could be the consequences for the product that we are used to exporting, and what it could be the consequences for obsolete technology that it could finish in our territory. No? So that is, in my point of view, the best way to convince internally and to keep the optimism. It is by showing that things are happening, that the economy has started to change, that many regions and countries of the world have already defined a net zero target, no, and also clear and real reduction by 2030.
Right.
And that is going to have consequences in the world economy.
Well, Manuel Pulgar-Vidal, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mark, and take care.